In this video, we're going to go over a few different topics. We're going to talk a little bit about what classical economics is, what Keynesian economics is, what fiscal policy is, and what are automatic stabilizers. And classical economics and Keynesian economics say different things about the role of government. So I want you to think for yourself about what the answers to these questions should be from your opinion. Should the government just enforce laws and defend us with an army to keep us safe? Is that all the government should do? Or should the government try to help fix some of society's problems? Problems like inequality, problems like discrimination, poverty, lack of health care. Should the government try to fix those problems for people? And if the government should try to solve problems, which problems should it try to solve? And then how should they try to solve them? One of the problems that some people think the government should try to help solve is when the economy slows down. A lot of people think that the government should try to do something to stimulate the economy, to help it grow again. But that is not what classical economics tells us the government should do. Classical economics really started with Adam Smith when he published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And it was a response to industrialization. Remember, industrialization was when a lot of people started moving to cities. People figured out how they could harness steam power to drive machines and start creating factories, and that let people get jobs in factories instead of being farmers for most of their lives. So this change made the economy more complex, and Adam Smith was one of the first ones who came up with a comprehensive way of thinking about how we could organize a complex economy just by allowing people to pursue their self-interest. So Adam Smith and other classical economists said that just allow people to pursue their self-interest and allow them to freely exchange, and they will figure out what the best production and prices in the economy will be. They'll figure it out just by figuring out what people want, how much they're willing to pay, and supplying at that price. And so when there are problems in the economy, classical economics says that business cycles will fix themselves. If prices go down, if the economy starts shrinking, prices will go down, and eventually it'll get cheap enough where people will start buying again, and then the economy will grow again. And if the economy is growing too fast, people will have to slow down eventually because they'll loan out too much money and some people won't pay it back, and so it'll slow itself down. And then something happened to challenge this idea of classical economics, which was the main idea in economics from the late 1700s all the way through the early 1900s. But then the Great Depression hit in 1931, right around 1930. And what happened was people started losing jobs, prices started falling, but because people were losing jobs, they also couldn't buy things, and so companies started laying off more workers, and banks started having people default on their loans. The money they loaned out wasn't getting paid back, so banks started failing, and there was this negative spiral where people kept losing jobs, not spending money, banks kept going bankrupt, and everything got worse and worse. And in the 1930s, there was another economist who was gaining a lot of respect for some of his ideas, and that was John Maynard Keynes. He lived from 1883 to 1946, and so he was most active in the early 1900s. But by 1930, he was an advisor to the leaders of the British government. He was British, and also advising the American politicians also. So he was an economist, and he challenged the idea that markets would fix themselves quickly. And one piece of evidence for this was what was happening in the Great Depression around the world. It was a negative spiral of people buying less, and then companies firing people, which means that they can buy less. And Keynes had an idea that involved the government. He said that the government can and should help stimulate aggregate demand when needed. He saw this negative spiral of people not spending as much, and then people getting fired, and then people continuing to not spend as much. The only way to stop it was have the government borrow money and spend to get things started again. Because if people weren't spending, someone needed to spend. And for Keynes, it was the role of the government. So Keynesian economics is just this idea that government can and should help stimulate aggregate demand when it's needed. Let's look back at what aggregate demand is, and we can see why Keynes came up with this idea. Remember, aggregate demand, or GDP, can be thought of as C, which is household consumption, I, which is business investment, so all the money that people spend on goods and services, all the money that businesses spend to run their businesses, G, which is government spending, all the things that the government spends on, and NX, which is net exports, the things that we sell to other countries. So which of these can the government most directly control? The answer is clearly G, government spending. The government can't force people to consume more in their households. The government can't really force businesses to invest more, but they can spend more. One good example of this is recovery.gov, which was part of the stimulus program under President Obama and helped by President Bush also, which was the government borrowing a lot of money to try to stimulate the economy and start up job growth. And this is where we get to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is simply the power the government has to tax, borrow, and spend. And there are two kinds. There's expansionary fiscal policy, which tries to stimulate aggregate demand, increase the amount of spending that happens in the economy, and contractionary fiscal policy, which is when the government tries to decrease aggregate demand and slow down the spending in the economy. So expansionary fiscal policy, it expands or increases aggregate demand, and that can come from things like tax cuts, because if you think about it, if the government lowers taxes, then the people who are doing the consuming have more money to spend, and so more money gets spent, which increases aggregate demand. Or the government can just increase its own spending. It can still collect tax money and then spend that money on building highways, building dams, and other infrastructure projects. It can also turn around and give that money to people who will spend it right away. It can run poverty reduction programs. It can hire more teachers. It can increase the military. It can do all kinds of things. It can also do both. It can cut taxes and increase spending, which will mean that the government will have to borrow money to pay for everything. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about deficits and debt. So I want you to figure out which direction these kinds of policies shifts aggregate demand. And if you said that it shifts aggregate demand to the right, then you're correct, because it increases aggregate demand. Contractionary fiscal policy is the opposite. It contracts or decreases aggregate demand. And that happens by tax increases. If the government takes more money away from individuals, then they'll spend less in the economy and aggregate demand will go down. It can also cut spending. If the government spends less money, then there will be less money spent in the economy, which decreases aggregate demand. Or it can do both. It can increase taxes and cut spending. And eventually, the government will have to do this because we have a large debt that we need to pay off. We need to pay off the money that we borrowed that we used to do the spending in years past. So I want you to think for a second, if government increases taxes and cuts spending, which direction will the aggregate demand curve shift? If you said that the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left, you'd be correct, because it's decreasing the aggregate demand by taking money away from individuals who would have spent it, or by spending less as the government itself. Automatic stabilizers are different from government just spending money by deciding to do projects. They are programs that increase spending when times are tough and decrease spending when times are good. This happens automatically without Congress or the president having to do anything. It's already laws that have been written that do this automatically. Unemployment insurance is one example of an automatic stabilizer, because if people start losing their jobs, they can apply for unemployment benefits, and they can get money from the government to help them continue spending money even though they don't have a job until they get a new job. So automatically, when times get tough, the government gives them extra money so that they can continue spending. If there wasn't unemployment insurance, when you lose a job, you would just stop spending money because you wouldn't have any money to spend. And that, by having unemployment insurance, we don't decrease aggregate demand by nearly as much. Social Security is another type of automatic stabilizer because when people retire, if they didn't have Social Security, they might spend a lot less because they're not making money. But because we have Social Security, which pays people money while they're retired, they can continue spending money and keep aggregate demand up. And that, again, that happens automatically. It's something that you automatically qualify for at a certain age or if you lose your job. Medicare is another one. Medicaid. These are both programs that help people either who get too old to be working or are too poor to pay for health insurance, and it helps them when times are tough, automatically. And SNAP, or food stamps, is another way that the government helps people who automatically qualify for the program because they are going through tough times. And there's one more automatic stabilizer that I didn't mention in that list, and that is a progressive marginal tax. A progressive marginal tax simply means that people who make more money pay higher tax rates. So if someone who makes a little bit of money, they might pay 15 or 20% of their income in taxes. A rich person might pay 25 or 30% of their income in taxes. So not only are they paying more because they make more, they're also paying a higher tax rate. So let's look at what that looks like. And marginal, remember, marginal means for each additional unit. And we're going to see how that works in terms of the taxes in our country. So the way it works is the first $15,000 you make, you pay a low tax rate, maybe 15%. But then, say you get a raise, you make another $10,000. So you make $25,000 total. You pay 15% tax on the first $15,000 and 20% tax on the next $10,000. So you're paying a higher tax rate, but that 20% is only being taxed on the money you make above $15,000. Then if you get another raise and you make another $10,000, that money is taxed at 25%. So a quarter of that additional money goes to the government. And then any money above a certain level is taxed at a higher rate. The highest rate I think we have in this country for income is 35% tax. So as a rough estimate, if any money you make over $120,000 a year, you have to pay over a third of that money in taxes to the government. And this helps low-income people pay lower tax rates and high-income people pay higher tax rates than they would if everyone paid the same tax rate. And this progressive structure, meaning that poor people pay lower rates and rich people pay higher rates, is called progressive. And this progressive tax structure is an automatic stabilizer. Let's think about why. If someone gets a pay cut, they actually end up paying a lower tax rate. And if someone gets a bunch of raises, they pay a higher tax rate. The way this helps the economy stabilize is if you get a pay cut, you have to pay less in taxes. And if you have a pay raise, you pay more in taxes. So if everyone paid the same amount, then a pay cut, you would still have to pay the same rate percent in taxes. So it wouldn't change anything. But because we have a progressive marginal tax, any pay cuts get taxed less and less, which gives you more and more money to spend in the economy. And the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes, and less you have to spend in the economy. So it slows down aggregate demand, both when aggregate demand is falling because people are getting pay cuts, and when it's rising because people are getting pay increases. It slows down the decrease, and it slows down the increase. It keeps things more stable. And it happens automatically because people just automatically qualify for these different tax rates based on how much they make.